Great to have you with us. This is Kevin Pringle, former Director of Communications for the SNP at Westminster. Kevin, really interesting to get your take, actually, because with all economic announcements from Westminster, there's a bit of working through to be done in terms of what then happens for Scotland, how the SNP engage with it, and how much, I suppose, they bash the Tories for doing what they don't want them to do. What would be your strategy after today's budget as far as the SNP is concerned?
Well, I think there's always a bit of initial skirmishing. So we've heard that there's to be Barnett consequentials on top of education spending announced for England, and the SNP have already responded to that by saying actually the Scottish Government's budget has already been eroded by a greater extent than the Barnett money coming. So I think you always have to have that in the initial stages to basically set the scene into, if you like, win the terms of the argument. Is this basically good for Scotland? Is it bad for Scotland? I think when it's clearly very difficult from the perspective of the whole of the UK, because we can argue about specific measures, about specific timescales, the phasing of some of the announcements, but essentially this is an autumn statement, a budget package for an age of austerity. Then clearly it's going to be relatively easy for the SNP, as indeed for other opposition parties, to say this is essentially a bad deal. The SNP will argue it's a bad deal for Scotland and try to get that planted in the public mind in order to then seek to win the argument about, well, what should be done differently. And clearly the SNP's got a very clear message there in terms of, well, let's just get out of this, away from Tory government decisions in favour of an independent Scotland within the European Union.
Did you ever struggle in your time, and do you think the SNP could struggle now, in that by repeating the same thing over and over again, i.e. this is a bad deal, which is a line they use frequently, and that's fine, that's what they believe, and that's all totally acceptable, but actually does that just wear off? Do people stop listening to it when it's the same thing over and over?
Always struggled in my time, never now. When you look at election results, I think that's a fair observation, although I had some quite good campaigns I was involved in too. It's a balance, isn't it? It really is. There's a great merit in having consistency of message. I think it comes down to how you deploy it. You need a consistent message, and I think it was interesting that the SNP reaction to the autumn statement was out just slightly after Jeremy Hunt had actually sat down on the green benches. So clearly, because the message is clear, because it's consistent, it's pretty easy to do that. Of course, it can be difficult, but you just have to find ways and means of essentially saying the same thing with different illustrations in a different context. And it's very striking, certainly in the run-up to this budget today, that the SNP have been focusing very heavily on the comment by Michael Saunders a few days ago, the former member of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, where he basically said, if it hadn't been for Brexit, then we probably wouldn't be looking at an austerity budget of any shape or form this week. So that fits very well into the SNP's perspective and fits very well into the argument to say it's a bad deal, independence would be better, and we should be back in the European Union. So I think you need a consistency. It's very, possibly uniquely advantageous actually that the SNP have that, because at the end of the day its answer, its solution is always going to be independence would be better. And it's harder, I think, sometimes for the other opposition parties to know exactly where to pitch their argument in terms of the many facts, the many figures that have come out of the budget statement, and actually even more interestingly in some ways that have come out of the OBR report this afternoon as well. For the SNP, they can kind of cut through a lot of that and just say, well, independence is really where Scotland should be. It would be better than this.
Yeah. I wonder the impact. I was seeing one analysis that the Chancellor's cut to the additional rate threshold of income tax for very rich people from £150,000 to £125,000 a year will not, by default, apply in Scotland, but if the Scottish Government follows suit, then that would increase the number of Scottish income taxpayers at the top rate by 12,000, up from 22,000 people currently, and would raise around £40 million in revenue. There's something in that, isn't there, Kevin, that actually this could be a source of inspiration in some measures for Nicola Sturgeon to follow?
I think just as the SNP benefits from clarity on the Constitution, it does actually benefit, I think anyway, it benefits from having clarity, if you like, on that left-right social and economic policy agenda, such that it would not be instinctively attracted to not, essentially passing on a tax-raising measure that falls on the broadest of shoulders. Probably a more interesting issue in a sense, and an aspect of Scotland's economy that is not dealt with easily or quickly, is the fact that the numbers that you just referred to there about the numbers of people paying tax at that level are actually relatively small in Scotland. You could fit them into, essentially a football stadium. So there's a bigger argument to be had about how do we actually grow the economy, how do we build economic success, how do we attract investment and greater economic activity into Scotland and grow it in Scotland such that we've actually got more people paying higher tax, regardless of whatever the particular thresholds or rates happen to be. And again, I suspect from an SNP perspective that would take them quite quickly back into the issue of being in the European single market, being in effectively a domestic market that is 7 times the size of the UK market, for example, and they would argue that's economically a better place to be, albeit it would not necessarily be a simple or straightforward place to get to, but nonetheless the journey would be worth it, because from an economic perspective it would be a better, more vibrant, more advantageous place to be, so that actually there would be a higher number of people paying tax at that level compared to these relatively small numbers that you quoted.
Yeah, I understand.
We were talking at Kevin, we were talking at the top of this podcast about where we thought potential problems might be in the presentation of this autumn statement, and we were saying that one of the issues was selective briefing from the OBR's report, and obviously Jeremy Hunt has flagged this point about the OBR concluding that global factors are the biggest single problem in terms of our economic squeeze right now. But actually, it goes on to say Brexit has a significant adverse impact on UK trade and has contributed to reducing trade volumes and business relationships between the UK and the EU firms. So I do think it was to some certain extent, almost a misstep to peg so much on that bit when we all knew that there was a second bit to that which would be more helpful to opposition, and so it has come to pass. And how much of this is going to sort of help in terms of the campaign between now and sort of referendum to get back, because the country is still pretty evenly split on its views on this, isn't it? It's still pretty much 50-50, and nothing really seems to shift it. Do you think a good old, really hardened economic crisis might be the thing that gets it over the line? Kevin?
Oh, we've still got you, Kevin. Kevin, can you hear us?
Ooh, Kevin has frozen.
Hello, Kevin.
Sorry, I lost the signal. It's back now. Are you able to edit that? Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We can absolutely edit that. I'll just note that down. Kirsty, did you want to just ask the sort of the culmination of your question again, and that'll clean it up quite happily.
Shall I start from the top, as it were, but make it shorter?
No, it's okay. You can if you just sort of conclude with a
okay.
will an economic crisis tip
okay.
the balance, and then I can piece it together.
So Kevin, I was just interested in how much of an economic crisis of this level of of a level of this sort of profundity will actually tip the balance one way or another in terms of a referendum for independence.
It could do, only of course on the basis that people are persuaded that there is that better place to get to, and that the alternative for Scotland, the different trajectory, if you like, for the country would be not in the direction of, as the SNP would say, economic decline, essentially, as part of the UK, but to a much better place as Scotland independent within the European Union, within the single market. So it can go two ways, when you get difficult economic times. Sometimes it can make people quite cautious about change. But I think if there's a clear narrative, which, let's face it, both the Labour Party and the SNP and the Liberal Democrats, all the opposition parties, want to get across to people. They do want to get across the clear narrative that, yes, there's the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yes, there's still the hangover of COVID. We're still actually in a pandemic as we speak. But because the mini budget, that extraordinary period in UK politics of the Liz Truss premiership and the quasi-Kwarteng mini budget had such a dramatic impact and cut through to such an extent across the whole population, that there's a very clear perception, I think, now that actions of the government at Westminster have got a very significant role to play in what's happened and to play in the economic downturn that we're experiencing, and therefore are, essentially responsible, as Alison Thewlis said in the Chamber today, the £30 billion hit to the UK from the so-called mini budget, pretty big hit, is being paid for through tax hikes, through spending cuts. So it's not just the sort of prevailing conditions of the world. It's not the horrific Russian invasion of Ukraine solely. It's not COVID. It's actually actions and decisions by government. And if that can be planted, if you like, in the public mind in Scotland, then the issue becomes, well, let's get to a situation where we can take different decisions, where these sorts of decisions are not taken at Westminster, where they've been taken badly and chaotically, particularly over that Liz Truss period, but taken in a more orderly, responsive manner, of course, to the Scottish electorate in an independent parliament. So it all comes down, I think, to persuading people that it's about what politicians do that has made the difference here, has made the difference in a bad way, if you like, at Westminster, can make a difference in a better way in Scotland. And then if you can win that argument, you are potentially in a situation where you can win the argument to say, let's take decisions here in our own parliament and not have them taken badly and chaotically at Westminster.
Kevin, it's so good to speak to you. Just a very quick final one we're asking everyone today. Do you miss being in and around Westminster on a day like today, and the chaos of political point scoring, aftermath of a budget, an autumn statement?
Yes, I mean, I think you do always miss that, Buzz. I think you always do. But the only thing I ever say when people say, do you miss working in politics, I say, not in the evenings and at weekends. And I think that's probably the difference, because as you know, as we all know, it's just and it's probably even more so now than even when I was working in politics, but almost anything can happen at any time on any day, and so it's it's just pretty kind of all in. So it's nice to watch, to participate, to be massively interested, but not to be sort of on the receiving end.
It's
of
a very
call
good point, Kevin. It's a very good point. I miss smoking, but it doesn't mean it's good for me, right?
Well, indeed, absolutely. I'm glad you've given up.
Okay, Kevin, thank you very much, Kevin, for giving us your time today. It's so good to have you on.
Thank you.